Nietzschean Eugenics. The basic conception of Nietzschean eugenics is based on theories of race. Nietzsche was therefore a racialist thinker. To Nietzsche, there were a multipolarity of races. And best way to envisage that each race is like an iceberg within a vast ocean, maybe a handful of these icebergs floating isolatedly within the ocean. And therefore the vast area of those icebergs, of those individual races, is submerged and hidden under the sea. And only the tips can be seen, and those tips are known history, recorded history up to the present, and the vast areas under the ocean of those icebergs are, of course, prehistory. And so to Nietzsche, the vast area and weight of prehistory is completely of a vaster nature than the small area of known history. And therefore, to him, one's immediate parents are not as important as the huge train of our ancestors through millions of years. Those vast tracts of prehistory are far more decisive and important and have a lot more to say about who we are and what we are. And so he doesn't go along with the biblical idea of a singularity, that mankind begins in one place with one being, an idea which is echoed by woke science. So he doesn't believe in the biblical Adam, nor does he believe in the science of the African Eve. He thinks, and he's borne out here by many of the mythologies of the world, that mankind begins as a multipolarity. He believes in theosophical terms that there are root races, and that these root races exist in prehistory for a huge amount of time in an isolated fashion. They are small populations, primitive populations, who are isolated and do not come into contact with other human populations. They are rather pitted against nature and animal predators, and face also the problem of all isolated populations, which is the problem of inbreeding. And while inbreeding can heighten talents and abilities within the race, it also, of course, heightens deficiencies, diseases, and negativities within that population. And therefore, each of these isolated races must practice a form of eugenics, a primitive form of eugenics, in order to prosper and survive. And so, in those groups, the deformed, the debauched, etc., would have been ruthlessly killed and prevented from procreating if they were allowed to live, and any offspring deemed to be dysgenic would have been killed ruthlessly, as we know must have happened. So it is only after vast swathes of time, with the emergence of technology, primitive technology, and movement of the peoples, that the various isolated races come into contact with one another. And indeed, it is in those moments of contact that we start to see the emergence of what we know as prehistory. And those races which emerge into prehistory and therefore recorded history, we can briefly designate them by the crude colour terms, which is just a shorthand way of looking at the races. We go from the white to the black, through the yellow, red and brown. So we have the white race, the Caucasian race, European race, so-called. And then we have the red race, the Native American Indians, for example. And then we have the yellow race, the Chinese, for example. Brown races, the Indians, for example. And, of course, the black race, the sub-Saharan Negroes of Africa. So with these basic races, we have sub-races within them, and a sub-race within the white race, which is pertinent to our discussion here of Nietzschean Eugenics. We have the Aryan race, known also as the Indo-Europeans. And modern genetics does tell us that there's a DNA marker called R1A, which can be traced and seems to show that the Aryan race did indeed exist and emerge from the Russian steppes. One branch went into what is now known as India, and of course this is commensurate with the recordings of the Aryan invasions into India, and the other branch went into Europe and gives us what we now know as the European race. And we see that these movements are made because that race has invented forms of technology such as the war chariot, which allow it to mobilize and also conquer more defenseless races in its path. And therefore, with conquest and the organization of states, we have another form of eugenics known as the caste system. So we have the combination of natural selection, internal eugenics, as seen in Sparta, and the imposition of a caste system, as we see in India, and of course in the tripartite system of Europe, with the distinct classes of the warriors, the priests, the farmers, and the slaves and servants. So the caste system, the harsh barriers between races and classes, is maintained as a form of eugenics. And as we go into history, we see that some of these things start to break down as more and more contact is made between human races. And there is a culture shock happening, because for hundreds of thousands of years, these human races lived isolated, separate lives. In the modern world, in the modern era, in the era of emerging history, slowly but surely we see the contact between these isolated races start to happen on a vast scale, leading to all kinds of conflicts, wars, and dysgenics. And as certain dysgenic outlooks take hold, such as Christianity, liberalism, multiculturalism, wokeism, etc., as these mind viruses, as they're called, take hold, then eugenics is dispensed with as a bad thing. So is the caste system dispensed with as a bad thing. And natural selection disappears through the advancement of technology, an unintended consequence. And so suddenly mankind, in the modern era, and by modern I mean the post-Renaissance era, is thrust into this quagmire and nightmare of modernity and racial clash, where on the one hand you have race war, and on the other hand you have race poisoning. You can't win either way. You're either fighting another race, or you are mixing with another race and producing a mixed population, a dysgenic population, a population which lacks the ability to create culture and to will anything greater than itself. It's a no-win situation. And in a way, looking at it from that vast perspective from prehistory up to the present, it's not surprising, because for the vast amount of time, the submerged iceberg was isolated. And in the tip of the iceberg, suddenly, there's a clash and a mix and a hodgepodge. All those icebergs butting their heads together and coming into complete chaos. And so what's needed is a new form of eugenics that's in agreement with the modern world of science and apart from the old world of religion. And it's noticeable that when Nietzsche wrote his poetic version of this need in Thus Spake Zarathustra, producing the first part in 1883, which very much puts forward the need for the creation of a new superhuman race, a new eugenics, a new natural selection. But that same year, the Englishman Sir Francis Galton produced a book where he coined the term eugenics in 1983, the same year. This book, Inquiry into Human Faculties, 1883. Before that, Galton had produced a book in 1869 called Hereditary Genius. These two books by Sir Francis Galton, were in Nietzsche's library. In 1884, he carried out a study of Galton's books, those books, in English. Nietzsche had learnt English in Pforta. He wasn't a naturally strong English scholar, unlike his sister, but he could read English slowly. And he gleaned much from those books and knew that the Superman could only emerge via science. And the science would need to replicate the kind of pressures that primitive man placed on himself in prehistory. There would need to be a eugenics. There would need to be a caste system of some kind. There would need to be a form of selection, if not natural, then technological selection. The Superman will necessarily be created via technology. The technology which brought about the unintended consequences of racial disease and poison would need to create racial cleansing and purity, the Superman. And only as humanity crashes into the abyss, hopelessly mixed, hopelessly self-poisoned, only when that happens will the necessity of the emergence of a new superhuman race emerge, A race having learnt the lessons of past humanity, having learnt the need for eugenics, for caste systems, and for selection. That is Nietzschean eugenics.